I saw on the bulletin somewhere your thing: ordinary men called to an extraordinary challenge. You heard the scriptures read from the gospel recorded by John and Mark. And from that, of those scriptures, I'd like to speak on that theme. Ordinary men called to an extraordinary challenge. Now, on this Men's Day, Father's Day, in the month of June, the month that the Magna Carta was signed, the month and this the day that the black folks in Galveston, Texas found out that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, Juneteenth. This day, Father's Day, the men here have decided to focus on the role of men in the community, in the family, and in the church, and have chosen this theme: ordinary men faced with an extraordinary challenge. And we know what the extraordinary challenge is, particularly for those of you who call yourselves African Americans. You know what the extraordinary challenge is. You know the statistic: about 68% of black children born in this country, born into households with single parents, mothers. You know the data. You know the number of black men in prisons in this country outnumber the ones that are in colleges and universities. A friend of mine told me recently that he saw on the internet, and I remember I'm not quoting this as a fact, he said it was on the internet. And he said that on the internet it was that there were more black men in prison in America than there were in slavery. Now, I'm not quoting that as that, I'm telling what he said. I have not seen that, and I wouldn't go out quoting that as something I had said. But the fact of the matter, that if it was a close enough number, that is still terrible. You know the statistics about the crime in our communities. You know the statistics about the gangs. You know all of the data. So that data creates an extraordinary picture of chaos. That data paints a picture of awesome problems and trouble, insurmountable odds to overcome. That is the challenge. Extraordinary challenge. And on the other hand, I say to you that ordinary men faced with that challenge can win. You see, you can look at the extraordinary challenge and say that it is too big. You can look at the statistics and be overcome by them. You can look at the data and be drowned by it. You can look at the numbers and be overwhelmed. You can look at all of that and say it is an impossible task. That the task is too great, the mountain too high. We cannot do anything about that. Or you can say that this is mission impossible. Or you can say, we can take this mountain. You know, sometimes when I go to lecture at colleges and universities or to schools, and I always make sure that the people have a language right when I come to speak. I never allow universities or schools to have me on their program and say, we're trying to figure out what's wrong with our kids. We're trying to figure out what's wrong with our communities, and we're trying to figure out what's wrong with our churches. Don't ever put my name on anything that you say you're trying to figure out anything. That reverend is not in front of my name for nothing. I already know what the problem is. I don't speak to anybody who I don't already know what their problem is. I don't lecture trying to figure out anything. You ought to shut your mouth until you get it right. So I don't talk about anything authoritatively unless I know what the problem is. So I didn't come to Samaritan Methodist Church to help you figure out your problem. I came to tell you what the problem is, so you can do what needs to be done. I'm not in the figuring out stage. I've passed. I've been there, done that. I'm in the know-how stage. So I already know what the problem is, and I know what the solution is. So I'm going to tell you today in just a few minutes how ordinary men can solve this extraordinary problem. And I'm going to tell you how the problem was created in the first place. The problem is a very simple problem. The problem that we have in our communities, the problem that we have in our homes, the problem that we have in our nation is that ordinary men stop doing ordinary things. And you will solve those problems when ordinary men go back to doing ordinary things. That's when you'll solve the problem. You don't need Dr. So-and-so to come and tell you this. I've written 10 books, 3 of them used as college textbooks, but I knew the problem that you're facing before I wrote any of those books. Ordinary men facing extraordinary challenges. We are in the shape we're in because we stopped doing ordinary things. And we are not going to return to any sense of stability. We are not going to return to any stage of civility. We are not going to return to any place of peace until we get ordinary men to start back doing ordinary things. Now you can dress it up any kind of way you want to. You can have folks come in and do study, and you can have the data and the statistics, and you can do charts all you want to. It's a waste of time. You're not going to change anything until ordinary men start doing ordinary time. You can elect black public officials all the way up from the local to the highest position in the land, and it's not going to change anything until ordinary men and women start back to doing ordinary things. You know, I often have people tell me when they're talking about their children, they tell me, and my sister used to tell me this, she had so much junk that they had bought their children, and she would say to me, I want my children to have what I didn't have. I want them to have what we didn't have. And my question is, what's wrong with us? I turned out quite well. I went from chopping cotton for $3 a day for doing speeches for $3,000 a speech. I've done pretty well. I've gone from not having the great majority of the colleges and universities in this country have their doors open to me when I was born to them using my textbook. Now, my book is a text now. What's wrong with me? I think that rather than trying to give our kids what we didn't have, you ought to spend more time trying to give them what you did have. Ordinary. So if this place was full of 25 and 30-year-old men with children, my sermon would be different. And that's who I want to talk to in the first place. We don't really need to hear that. We've either been there, done that. I'm going to tell you this maybe so that you can tell your kids and your grandkids. We need to get back to the ordinary things. And what are the ordinary things that we ought to be doing? And they're very ordinary. Men ought to be doing the ordinary things that men ought to do in the house. They ought to provide. They ought to provide. They ought to provide leadership. They ought to provide guardianship. They ought to provide rulership in their homes. Now, I want to stress rulership. Now, there's this big argument about whether kids should be spanked or whether kids should be this and all of that kind of stuff. And I have friends who will not spank their kids until they call me, well, I'm getting ready to spank this boy. So, well, I'm not for spanking. Except for one reason. We used to, the black people in the South, they used to whip their children. And they thought that accomplished a lot more than it actually did. I think that most of us over a certain age were spanked at some point when we were kids, but we thought that accomplished more than it actually accomplished. Most of us were in church by the time we were 12 or 13 years old. So we don't know whether the spanking helped us or whether Jesus got into our hearts and told us to do what was right. So I don't think that spanking did as much as we think it did. But I tell my friends, I will approve of you spanking your sons for one reason. That reason is that every child, boy particularly, needs to know that wherever he goes in this country, somebody is in charge. That wherever you go, somebody's in charge. And that one of the things that the daddy ought to do is to let the child know, I am in charge of this house. Now, if you have to spank him to do that, then it's better for you to spank him to do that than somebody to pull a gun on him in prison. And because it's going to be done eventually, that's going to have to be done. He's going to have to learn that wherever you go, somebody's in charge. I was lecturing up in Omaha, Nebraska several years ago, and this friend of mine, it was a family thing, and I had to do 3 nights of lectures, and one night I talked about parents and their kids and stuff, and the rulership in the home, and this minister came to me after the sermon. He said, Jenkins said, I'm pretty smart, and I've thought about this kind of thing. He said, but you reminded me of something tonight. One of the things that I said in my sermon, that every man should let his sons know that he was in charge and that the mother was more important to the daddy than he was to the child. He said that one day he had said something smart to his daddy, to his mother, and said that the daddy heard it. And said the daddy got up in his face and said, if I ever hear you talk to my wife like that again, I'm going to, and I won't say what he said, and you'll have to find you a place to stay. And he said that day he can't understand that his mother was partly protected by his daddy, and his daddy was in charge of that house, and there were certain things that the daddy was not going to tolerate as long as he was in charge. So every child needs to know that there's a man in charge. And you say, oh, well, the women can be in charge. Don't fool yourself. After boys get to be 12, 13, 14, 15 years old, if Jesus is not in their heart, there's not a whole lot that women can do. Unless there's a strong man in the background that they know that if they mess over your sister, you come in there and get them. Ordinary things. I listen to grown people talk about their childhood, and I have never heard grown people say anything that happened that was extraordinary. It's the ordinary things that teach values. It's the ordinary things that endear children to their parents. It's the ordinary things. This man was very, very great, and he was thinking about his father and his relationship to his father, and he didn't think about anything great. He thought about something very ordinary. He said, back when I was a child, before life removed all the innocence, my father would lift me high and dance with my mother and me, and then spin me around till I fell asleep. Then up the stairs he would carry me. And I knew for sure that I was loved. Ordinary things. When I and my mother would disagree, he said, to get my way, I would run from her to him, and he'd make me laugh and just to comfort me. Then finally, make me do just what my mama said. Later that night, when I was asleep, he left $1 under my sheet. Never dreamed that he would be gone from me. Simple, simple, simple things. And of course, you know, that's the word from Luther Vandross, Dance with My Father. Simple things. We need to do simple, ordinary things. And men need to do ordinary things in the community. Men need to do ordinary things in the community. And what are the ordinary things you need to do in the community? Well, you need to monitor the community. You need to mentor the children in the community, and you need to meddle in the community. You need to monitor. You need to mentor. You need to meddle. I heard the things read about the individual that received these awards that you get, and one of the things were that it was involved. You need to monitor. You need to know what's going on in your community. You need to know what's going on with the kids in your community. All the kids on my side of the street, or my end of my street, I know what's going on with them. Even if they don't like it, I know. I ask them. I know what schools they're going to. I know what grades they're making. One of your great kids, Ellis, lives across the street from me. And I know what Ellis's grades are. And I know that whenever he comes home, he's going to sleep the first day. And the second day, he's going to come to my house. And he's going to tell me all the stuff that's going on. Because he knows I'm interested. You have to meddle. You have to meddlers, Christian meddlers. You need to know what's going on with the kids. You have to ask questions. You have to show your interest, your involvement. You know, it's amazing. There are kids in our communities who are going to college and nobody knows it but them and their parents. There are kids, now we know who's in prison. We know who's in trouble, but there are kids right around us doing wonderful things, and nobody says anything to them. You have to learn to meddle in a Christian way. You know, when you all were kids, you know there was always somebody in the neighborhood, on the steps, on the porch, in the yard, meddling. I'm going to tell your mama, boy. I'm going to tell your daddy. We've gotten away from that. But that's what people used to do. Those are very ordinary things. There was a kid that worked at a store down near where I live. About 5 years ago, I met this boy. He was in high school at the time, and how do I know? I asked him. And he was having issues in high school. How do I know? I asked him. He was considering not going to college. How do I know? I asked him, and I told him he needed to go to college. And he went to college. And he dropped out of school. And I was asking him about that. He told me some of the problems he was having. I was asking him about that. And then he left his job at the store after about a couple of years. And for about 8 months, I didn't see him. And one day I saw him on the corner of Taylor and Martin Luther King. And I threw on the brakes and said, "Come here, boy. Where have you been? What happened at the store?" And he told me about the job at the store, and how he had lost his job and stuff. And I said, "Well, you need to get in school." He said, "Okay." Mr. Jenkins, I had given him a book to read. He said, "I'm going to get in school." Then I didn't see him for a long time, and finally I saw him again. Coming from church one Sunday, I saw him, and I stopped again and said, "You don't fit out here on this street. You are not like these people. You need to get back in school." He said, "Oh, Mr. Jenkins, I'm going to do it." He called me the next day, and he talked, and I didn't hear from him for about a year. I didn't know what had happened to him. He wasn't around for me to meddle anymore. Then about a week ago, I got an email from him. And he says, "Mr. Jenkins, how has life been treating you? Good, I hope. I've had my ups and downs since the last time I spoke with you. It seems that things you told me to look out for have smacked me right in the face. Being a 25-year-old man now, I really can't find it in my heart to ask a man for help. But since you have enough education for yourself and 1,000 other people, I wonder where you got that from, I don't feel so bad. One thing I can say, that the things you told me are haunting me right now. Because just like a self-centered person, just when I thought I had a hang on life, I really forgot where I came from, in a sense. Not to contact you on bad terms, I just had to be up front with you, because if I had lived by what you said and not just listen, this letter would be so much different. So if you give me a chance to talk to you and ask for guidance, it would be highly appreciated. Now, when I got this email, this boy worked at this store about 2 years. I'm just a strange old man he met. I wonder how many people, how many men said anything to that kid in the 2 years that he was at that store. How many folks asked him, what are you trying to do, young man? Where are you going in life? Are you in school? How many meddled in the Christian way? This young man sent me this email. I assume he doesn't know a whole lot of other people who could guide him and help him. There are plenty of people around. But they did not meddle. They did not let him know that they were concerned. Those are ordinary things. Those are not just, well, I don't have a whole lot of education. Well, you don't need a whole lot of education to do some of the things that we need to do in our communities. It is not about education. It's about caring. It's about concern. It's about doing the ordinary things that people used to do, and somehow you stop doing them. And what about our churches? You know, if all of the men, if all of the families were in this church, this place would be packed this morning. If nothing all that great and outstanding, if the ordinary men had done ordinary things, had brought their children to this church and emphasized to them the importance of staying in the church, if they had done that, this church would be packed this morning. If they had done ordinary things. And you say, well, we just, our ordinary things wouldn't have made a difference. Oh, yes, it would have. You know, a couple weeks ago, one of the great ministers in this city, Dr. Gillespie, died. William Gillespie, the great Presbyterian preacher, brilliant Presbyterian church. He came here in 1956. He was handed the keys to a church that had been closed. No members and water in the basement. And he did a very ordinary thing. He went door to door and told people he was a preacher, and that was the church, and they needed to get involved and save the church. They not only saved the church, they made it one of the great churches, and he became one of the great voices, not just in St. Louis, but in the Presbyterian church and in the church universally. Be doing ordinary things. In 1982, there was this man who went to a job. He took an ordinary job. Oh, it would seem ordinary to some people, but it was extraordinary to him. He took this job in Baltimore. And he went to work. And he worked every day. He was supposed to work on this job for the whole year. And nobody paid much attention to it, because a lot of people work on their jobs every day for the first year. But then he showed up the second year, and he worked every day on his job for the second year. And he did it for the third year, and then the fourth year, and the fifth year, and the sixth year, and the seventh, eighth, ninth, and 10th year. And people really started paying attention. This guy has come to work every day for all of these years. And then as those days, those years began to mount up, they start saying he might break this record set by Lou Gehrig. 1,230 days covered the work straight starting. Nobody can do that. And this man kept coming and finally broke that record. and came to work every day for another 5 years, establishing a record that nobody will break, probably. Cal Ripken Jr. went to the Hall of Fame. Now, Cal Ripken Jr. batted .276, a lifetime batting average, hit 431 home runs, got over 3,000 hits, but none of those reasons are why Cal Ripken Jr. is in the Hall of Fame. Cal Ripken Jr. is in the Hall of Fame because he did the most ordinary thing a man can do, and that is he showed up to work every day. That's why he's in the Hall of Fame, because he showed up to work every day. That's what fathers have to do. That's what men have to do. They have to show up to work every day. Tired, you have to show up to work. Mad with the wife, you have to show up to work. Don't want to talk to the children, you have to show up to work. You have to show up to work every day. When I first came to St. Louis, I met this man who was an old man then. He was my age, and I was about 30. I thought he was old. His name was Larned Johnson, and he worked in construction. He did roof work. I did not know at the time I met him that he would be working for me for the next 30 years. From time to time, they would come over. And this man worked until he was in his 70s. And then he got into his 80s and kept working. And in his 90s, he was working. When Mr. Johnson was 95 years old, he was still climbing 40-foot ladders. About 3 years ago, Mr. Johnson died. And they called me and told me they wanted me to come and speak at his funeral. Well, I went to the funeral. Now, Mr. Johnson was an ordinary man. I don't even know when he graduated from high school. But there I was at his funeral. People came from everywhere. People with doctorate degrees, people who owned businesses, came to Mr. Johnson's funeral. And every one of those people had been touched by him. And several of them got up and talked about how he had monitored them, how he had mentored them, how he had meddled and shown concern about them. It was a wonderful experience. And at the end of the funeral, I thought to myself, this man is also in the Hall of Fame. He is in the Dad's Hall of Fame. He's in the Men's Hall of Fame. Because if you work and do your work every day, it may be thankless work, it may be work that you're criticized for, but if you go every day and do what you're supposed to do, one day you will be in the Hall of Fame. Now, those two scriptures in closing, Jesus was called. In those two scriptures, one man had brought his son to Jesus. His son had been sick since birth. It was an extraordinary challenge. There's other scripture where Jesus was calling his disciples. They had no idea what they were getting ready to do. It was an extraordinary challenge. They were getting ready to change the face of the earth. They were getting ready to start a new idea upon the earth that would go endlessly. But they didn't know it. These ordinary men, were being called to an extraordinary challenge. And they did it. You have what it takes to turn everything around, because you have Jesus and his vision and his power to face extraordinary challenges and overcome them.